Hello everyone, it's Mike Levin on Wednesday, March 11th, 2020. And I figured since I shoot these videos without editing anyway on YouTube, I might as well get practice in on YouTube Live, go live, which is what YouTube keeps trying to compel me to do. And I seem to be the prime target candidate for YouTube streaming, so here we go. I have just loaded up into my first virtual window here a Linux shell. I will have to formalize my terminology. I always want to say Unix shell because traditionally this kind of stuff comes from the Unix world, but these days Linux has pretty firmly won over Unix with the one exception of Macs, which are actual Unix based. And we'll get into all that kind of education later. But the Windows 10 Linux subsystem is Ubuntu Linux, which LSB release. I'm trying to get into the habit of being able to do this command real easy, the Ubuntu command for showing what you're on. And we're on 18.04 here, which from previous videos you know I have downloaded from the Microsoft Store. So a little about my system. I am a big fan of these ribbons of virtual screens, which exist on all three major platforms now, which are Windows 10, Mac, and let's call it Linux Desktop. Ubuntu and KDE each has their own version of these ribbons. And people have tended to gone horizontal. The vendors have tended to go on horizontal with this so that it's really easy to remember where you are in sort of a left-right sort of thing. And you can see here that on my first window, I always keep my terminal, my Linux terminal, for the express purpose of going into my journal, which reminds me every day what it's all about. Organize, visualize, prioritize, and chip away. And I think today I'm going to help you visualize what I'm doing here with my system, because this is a time of great change. I'll start a new journal entry. This is a time of great change. And my ways of working are designed to be change enduring. That is, changes to the platform. That's the main thing, because changes to the platform has a lot of stuff that's implied. You know, that's the Mac versus Windows and Linux desktop. It's also desktop versus mobile, and there's also a number of other things in here. I would go as far as to say mainstream versus cobbled together, or off the beaten track. There's a lot of stuff here, and that should really be a bulleted list. So I'm going to show you Vim a little bit. Vim is interesting because it's a text editor that will stay with you for life, and it's also one of the most controversial ones that I advocate. Tools are everything because tools start to get into your muscle memory, and when stuff gets into your muscle memory, you tend to want it to be with you for your entire life. You don't want to have to constantly be relearning. So I guess my ways of working are designed to be change enduring and preserving muscle memory and expertise. Times might be applicable because there's definitely compounding returns effects here. And so clearly I like to have a Linux terminal and Vim in my first window. My second window, while you see it here being my live streaming, I actually always start up my browser with, it used to be Jupyter Notebook, but it's now Jupyter Lab automatically by default. So we have this extra, well, it doesn't even show it. Yeah, this is the extra. This is the extra terminal window. It looks like a Jupyter Lab icon, which is really the console, the server window for what's going on in the browser here. So you can already see a connection between that more terminal-based world that is on screen 1 and what I actually have going on screen 2, which, while yes, it's a browser, this is really a way to consume services. It's much like the operating system. And I will go on to say this third screen is usually my everyday work area. I often have Microsoft Excel here or another web browser, Edge, to keep a different login context. But what I'm going to do right now is Art Rage, because with these 3 windows set up and with live broadcasting mode, I do believe I am in a unique position to explain to you what I guess I would call my reality, but it's more like a triality. So the triality consists of 3 thinking or learning types. This, believe it or not, is auditory as opposed to visual. And there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of pre-knowledge involved in these types of windows. It's like singing or musical instruments or martial arts. If you don't know stuff beforehand, you're not going to be able to learn it real easily. So let's see, this is my system designed for, and I'll use some lightweight markdown so that if I ever showed this in a sort of layer that interprets markdown, I would have my headlines, my subheads, my H3s. And so, this H3 here is, my reality, triality. And the first one is these types of windows, which, while they're text-based windows, they are really auditory in nature. This is the Linux terminal, which is auditory in nature. As you hear me talking, you see me writing those same words. Now, the browser is a little bit different because it's both visual and auditory. I would have gone with almost entirely visual, but it sits in the middle of the 3 types of thinking, auditory being here, visual and auditory in the middle, and then, of course, mostly visual, which I'll go and compromise first thing by giving it a headline, triality, and I'll illustrate it. This is okay, so what do I really want to draw most here is, so you got this image. This is pretty clear. Text-based, the browser, which is really both, and then a drawing environment. Now, a lot of people think that what I'm really doing here is advocating Windows because it's sort of the host operating system. So am I really advocating this here? Not really. Because what exists down at this level is the host operating system. And it happens to be Windows in my case right now, but I am really not advocating it because the purpose of these host operating systems is to, provide a number of services. One of them is their own app app sitting right on top of the host OS. This is native apps. And these things are often privileged and tied to the hardware. If it's a game platform, you have really high performance 3D engine games here, virtual reality. But there's two other services that these host OSs provide, and very typically one of them is, I don't like the way I drew that at all. It's interesting, this is live. This is the browser. I'll make it a little bit bigger, give it as much as it deserves. And so a whole bunch of other types of apps exist here that are just more standard, and they're still quite consumer based. So, you know, all this stuff is sort of consumer oriented. Now there's this new thing going on with Windows. They sort of gave in to the pressure, such as it were, gladly, because the writing is on the wall that there is a level of providing services which is Linux. And the reason for that is because consumers are not the only users of these host OS platforms. It's also developers. And in the case of Windows as the host OS, the way it provides this is WSL3 or WSL2. Jumping ahead a little bit. The Windows subsystem for Linux 2. And when you have that Linux platform there, you now have a whole other sort of world of capabilities, which is what I concern myself with, because on top of Linux now you have a terminal. And interacting with this terminal is almost everything. So, in this world, you really are, with the exception of what I happen to be showing, Jupyter Notebook, which is a highly developer-oriented environment and a creative environment. It's generally about web search and other types of things. There are some productivity environments, but all they're really doing then is taking advantage of the web's ability to provide a similar layer to the Linux terminal here to the mainstream world. So there's a lot of things here that satisfy most needs. But whenever anything becomes custom, I'll have to do something about this. This is my early days of this streaming stuff. But everything custom goes here. So as long as you are determined to add value, you're going to look for where you sort of fit into this picture to add value. And even though I advocate using Windows right now today only because of the superior hardware, I do not advocate Windows as your long-term host OS, nor do I advise building a dependency on the host OS layer. The idea here is when you're ready, you can switch out, because this can exist on any system. This, believe it or not, can exist on any system. And this drawing stuff, it's another story. It's a little bit of a rabbit hole there to talk about the drawing stuff. But of course, your muscle memory from drawing is something that's internal to you. And while there's a little bit of muscle memory to be developed here on switching tools, not much. It's like switching pens and colors and stuff. You'll always be able to settle in real quick on new underlying host operating systems for your drawing level. There is very little hardware dependency on your drawing skills. You could draw on just normal paper. It's a natural API. The API here is pretty similar too. Web browsers exist on any underlying hardware platform, and things are greatly the same. So you are once again not creating any large hardware OS dependencies here. However, here in your text editing, if you're not using a tool like Vim and you're using a tool like Visual Studio Code, VS Code, right, which I have here under my frequent things I use. So I'll add I'll just jump out here to this window and I'll pull up VS Code. And what's going on when you start using VS Code for all these code writing things, because it's very appealing. VS Code is pushed out in front of you, and of all places, the Anaconda Navigator. I'm going to show you why VS Code is becoming so popular, in addition to just Microsoft pushing it. Anaconda Navigators coming up here. Live is wonderful. Let's see if I'm giving anything away here. You got my Gmail address. Git config, it's my git config. Yeah, okay, that's fine. You're allowed to see that. If you want to email me, go ahead. This is not a fast loading application, but it's all the various things that get pre-installed with Anaconda. So on a prior video, I had told you a lot about, the different ways to install Python. And installing Python by installing Anaconda gives you Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebook. It also gives you VS Code, which is a Microsoft tool, which, while it's under a free and open source license for its uncompiled code, the compiled binary is actually under a different license. Now, I'm not putting it down because of that, but what I will readily tell you is that what you're doing is you're creating an actual hardware platform dependency, and you're locking yourself into the Windows platform. While it will, in fact, run on other platforms, because it's built on Electron, it's built on a Google technology, believe it or not, you are now dependent on Microsoft for your tool chain. By design. And all these really powerful things they can do with Python, like, they can do a lot of Python REPL stuff. Read eval print loops, which has taken the computer data science world by storm so much through the form of Jupyter Notebook. Microsoft is providing all these Jupyter Notebook and Jupyter Lab capabilities directly in VS Code to prevent you from going down these other paths that give you long-term complete OS independence, right? If you embrace These, because you really can't get away from them, the browser, what, you're going to get away from browser or native apps? It just isn't going to happen. There's too much good stuff there to walk away from. And you embrace the Linux terminal, then you'll be able to do everything that is custom without a dependency. You get to cut out of your process hardware and platform and OS dependencies. So one day this all just goes away, and what you're left with is the ability to do anything, anytime, anywhere, as far into the future as technology continues to be, because this stuff is fundamental. It's fun and fundamental, and I'll be teaching you why. Okay, that must be painful enough to watch in live, and oh, okay, yeah, that's my video. This is one of my first steps to show that I am not one of these, one-trick ponies on YouTube. I have neither really planned this video or scripted it, but I think I start to get my idea across really well, in that everything about Windows, everything about these, graphical user operating systems is a lightweight shim. I'll just do this here. Purpose of OS/hardware. Provide a lightweight shim. And if you don't know shim, you ought to go Google it, because it's an important concept in all this. Really big computer software concept. You're going to find that a shim, in the traditional sense, is a washer and thin strip of material used to align parts or to make them fit or reduce wear. It's also a wedge or something to fill up space, right? But in the computer science connotation, a shim is a library that transparently intercepts API calls and changes the arguments passed, and it handles the operation itself or redirects the operation elsewhere. Shims can be used to support an old API in a newer environment, or a new API in an older environment. So what you are doing is you're using the OS or hardware to provide a lightweight shim, ensuring your better API skills, in other words, terminal, have a place to run from. And another big purpose is to be interchangeable. To eliminate OS and hardware dependency. So you see, the whole purpose of the OS and the hardware is to provide you a way to do things in a much more old school way, so that you don't have dependencies on the current OS or hardware, which really is fads. It's a point in time, and it is perishable knowledge, skills. It has a shelf life. These platforms last, 5 to 10 years max. However, this older school stuff is to give you stuff you can rely on for, 20 to 40 years. Unbelievable? Absolutely not. This environment I'm using right here, Vim, is based on VI. Vim came out in 1991, and VI came out in, I believe, the late 70s. So, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, 2020, we are already up to that 40-year limit. Not limit, it's going to go beyond that. We're up to that 40-year threshold for the very tool I'm using, or at least the progenitor of the tool I'm using. There's this VI versus Vim issue, and you learn Vim and you get by on VI. And that's pretty much what I'm advocating. So there you have it. I'll talk a lot more about this stuff soon, but this was a pretty good start for a live streaming experiment. I hope it got the whole thing. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget to subscribe and tell everyone about my channel.